Hi, my name is Ken Shackel. I'm from Plant Sciences Department at UC Davis, and I'm going to talk about how to measure crop water stress and monitor it so that you can use it for drought irrigation strategies. We have some general recommendations about how to save water during a drought. One of them is to control the weeds. Weeds are a mixed blessing for a drought. They do use water, so if it's during the season and you're not expecting any rain, then you should control the weeds because they'll use water and we want to save that for the plants. If you're expecting rain, then a weed cover or a mulch cover may be very good for water penetration, and so it's a balance between whether you think you can expect some rain or whether we're finished with the rain for this year. But basically, control the weeds. The irrigation system uniformity is very important, especially when you're deficit irrigating. So you should try to tune up your irrigation system, make sure that you're not overwatering some areas and underwatering other areas. What I'm going to emphasize today mostly is to use the pressure chamber to identify areas of your fields that may be under more stress than other areas, and to try to help you to modify and optimize the amount of water that you put on your plants. There's a few general recommendations. We've done most of our research in almonds, and this is a big crop in California that we can make for almonds. One is that we don't have any evidence, even though we have looked for it, that pruning or spraying the trees with whitewash or kaolin sprays has any beneficial effect in terms of drought conditions. It may seem like it should be a good idea, but we have actually measured it and found that it really doesn't do anything, and it's probably not worth the cost of the practice. In almonds, we know that mild to moderate stress at the beginning of hull split is a good idea to speed up hull split and reduce hull rot, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So actually some stress is good for almonds. And this year, we may be in that situation regardless of how you try to manage your water. Now, the basic planning exercise that you should go through has to do with what we call ET, or evapotranspiration. There are plenty of websites here that are indicated that will help you with this, and it's the way that you plan your irrigation ahead for, let's say, a normal year, and figure out if you've got enough inches of water to put on for a normal year, or maybe you have half the amount of water that you'll be able to apply. All of that is basically taken into consideration when you plan your irrigation based on the ET approach. So what I'm going to talk about here is an irrigation experiment in almonds where there were drought irrigation was tried for 3 years. That is, giving the trees different amounts of water. The control trees, which is what you see here in this black dot, were given the most water, about 42 inches, and had the highest yield. The rest of these trees were giving less amounts of water, as you can see on the y-axis. And the 3 different letters, A, B, and C, had to do with how that deficit of irrigation was managed. In the A deficit, the deficit was mainly placed in the early part of the season and not so much in the late part of the season. And the B deficit had most of the deficit was in the late part of the season rather than the early part of the season. The C deficit was what we call an even deficit over the season. That is the same percent of the evapotranspiration, but just a reduced percent throughout the season. And what you can see from this graph is that all the C's are above pretty much all the A's and B's. That means that as far as bang for the buck is concerned, an even deficit over the season gives you the best results. You'll always get lower yields if you have less water, but you get the most out of that water if you just provide an even irrigation deficit over the season. So that's pretty much what we recommend for all trees. Now, that's the basis for planning your irrigation scheduling. But obviously, when you manage irrigation, what you're trying to manage is the way the plant is feeling and responding. Here's an example of a plant that's well hydrated and a plant that's severely dehydrated, and obviously we want to try to avoid severe dehydration. So this is where the main part of this talk is going to be focused on, and that is how to measure the level of stress in the plant. We use what's called the pressure chamber method. It's a lot like measuring the blood pressure of a human. And because water flows in a plant, it doesn't circulate like blood does, but it does flow through the plant under pressure. In fact, it flows through the plant under tension. So the units that we use to measure the water, what we call the water potential of the plant, are pressure units, just like in blood pressure. However, they're different units, but bigger numbers mean more stress, just like blood pressure. In the units that we use for plant water potential, or for the blood pressure of plants, is a bar or a megapascal. 10 bars is the same as 1 megapascal, and just to put that into context for you, 10 bars is 145 pounds per square inch, which is quite a lot of pressure, and that's a relatively normal reading for a plant blood pressure. Just to put that into your maybe framework, that would be a reading of 7,500 on the blood pressure meter. So obviously we can't use the same kind of equipment with a plant as we use for humans. Also, the values are negative because water is under tension, not under pressure. The first rule is that when we measure stress, we find that plant stress is not an either-or thing. You can have minimal stress, you can have mild stress, moderate stress, severe stress. All of these levels are possible for plant stress, so you can't talk about it as though the plant's either under stress or not under stress. In fact, we have a handout here that you can get from this website that shows the different levels of stress. In this column on the left, various levels of bars of stress from 10 bars or 5 bars, and for walnut or almond or prune, what these levels of stress mean. And what you'll notice from this table is that, for instance, a value of 10 or 12 bars might be a mild or moderate stress for almond or prune, but for walnut, that's a very severe stress. So each type of tree has its own level of stress that corresponds to the symptoms, and that's very important. So what we do to measure this is we go out to the tree and we have to sample a leaf in order to measure the water potential in that leaf. We leave that leaf on the tree for about 10 minutes while you go and put bags on other leaves on other trees. And after that leaf has settled down for about 10 minutes, the reading on that leaf is what we call the stem water potential of that tree. So you harvest that leaf, put it inside a chamber, in this case, pump the chamber up with a hand pump, and then what you're watching for is you're watching for the end of the leaf that's sticking out of the pressure chamber. It's sticking out through a seal. You're looking for the xylem tissue right here that I'm pointing to in the middle, and you're looking for water to come out of that xylem tissue. And so it goes from being dry to being wet. I'm going to go back, so it's dry, and there it's wet. And the pressure that water comes out at is called the stem water potential of the plant. You can see it pretty well through a magnifying lens here, as you can see, and down in the bottom here there's a website that has a little demonstration video that will demonstrate the use of the pressure chamber. Now there's a lot of commercial varieties that you can get. Some of them work like a pump, like a bicycle pump. Some use nitrogen gas, but basically it's the same principle and pretty much the same thing depending on what kind of machine you like. Some of us call this a pressure bomb. It used to be called a pressure bomb. The reason why it's called a bomb is not because it's dangerous, but it's because this part of the chamber looks like what's called a bomb calorimeter in chemistry. So that's what its old title was. Some of us still refer to it as the bomb or the pressure chamber. Now what we recommend is that you sample the leaf between 1 o'clock and 3 o'clock in the afternoon. That's the best time because that's when the plant is under the most stress and the time when you can measure the stress most effectively. But during that time, depending on if it's hot or dry or cool or humid, you will get a different reading even from a fully irrigated tree. And so this table here gives you an idea of what that relationship is like. So if the temperature is mild, like in the 70s, and the humidity high, like 60%, then the reading will only be about 5.3 bars. Whereas if it's a very hot, dry day, 110 degrees and 20% humidity, that same tree in wet soil will be 12.6 bars. So most of the time the tree reads sort of in the 7 or 8 bar range under fully irrigated conditions. There are some web resources to help you to help you find what the baseline is. Here's a website address. You can use this address and you can go to a Google map and you can zoom in right on your location. For instance, I've zoomed in here on Davis location and chosen the weather station called the Simis Weather Station that's closest to my location. And I've typed in here a date and a time. And then when you press whatever this word is here that I can't read very well, you get the readings, the temperature, the humidity readings, and then the pressure bomb reading in bars that you would expect for that particular day. And you see here they're different for almond and prune versus walnut. And also we have grapes with what's called stem water potential and grapes with leaf water potential, which is a little bit different. But I've been talking about the stem water potential. In any case, what these baseline values tell you is whether the tree is fully irrigated or not. Now, if we are having a deficit irrigation situation, then they're not going to be fully irrigated. But what that means is that if you do get readings that correspond to the fully irrigated readings, you're nowhere near needing to irrigate. You can wait until they get at least a few bars off of that, below that, more stress than that, before you begin irrigation. So in that way, these baseline values can help you manage your irrigation and only irrigate the trees when they need it. Now I'm going to talk about another drought study that we did in almonds, and in this case there was no irrigation given to some trees, but it was only done for one season in order to find out what you can do during a drought that will be helpful. For instance, in this treatment we have no irrigation, but there was a little bit of rain in the season, 2 inches of rain, similar to what we're getting now. And the trees used 5.5 inches out of the soil because there was water in the soil. In most cases, there will be some water stored in the soil from winter rains. So what was interesting is that even though the control trees got almost 31 inches, we gave only 3 inches, so about 10% of full irrigation to one of the treatments, this 3.6 inch treatment. And it turned out that they were able to use more inches of water out of the soil when we gave them a little water compared to 5.5 inches when we didn't give them any water. And what this means basically is that even small amounts of water can be helpful. These amounts of water were applied, just like I said, in the C irrigation regime, an even deficit over the season. So basically small amounts of water are still useful to you and can still improve the situation for the trees to take up water from the soil. Now, just to give you an idea about what these trees might look like at different levels of stress, this is a control tree. It has -9 bars of stem water potential. As I said, 10 was pretty normal. This is what a tree looked like at the same time, June 29th. That was given 10 inches of water, and now it has 25 bars of stem water potential, which would be called moderate to severe stress. And this tree at the same day was 40 bars of stem water potential, and you might notice that's not even on the scale of our stress meter. So this was very severe stress. And in fact, for this particular tree, it got all the way down to 63 bars, which was kind of a record for us. And by July 28th was entirely defoliated. So it goes without saying this tree didn't have any yield in that year, but it was very severe stress for that particular tree. and it also didn't have any yield the next year because there was no flowering, but it did not die. It survived. So almonds are very tolerant of stress, but their response to stress is pretty much related to how much stress they experience. So this graph shows for the 4 years where we did this study, 2009 through 2012, the control trees had about 2,500 pounds of nut meats per acre yield, and that was pretty much the same across the years. But these different levels of stress, for instance, a 20-bar stress or a 30-bar stress or a 40-bar stress, were all associated with lower and lower yields in the year of the drought and particularly in the year after the drought. So more stress means less almond yield, and the biggest reduction in yield occurred the year after the stress, but then by the next year and the year after that, they were pretty much up to normal. So that's what you can kind of expect. And for almond trees, as far as we know, even a very, very high reading, which is well beyond the ability of that bicycle pump type pressure chamber to measure, even that amount of reading may not be enough to kill an almond tree. But almond trees do respond very strongly to water, especially young almond trees. So just because they're tolerant of water stress doesn't mean that they like water stress. So for instance, here is an example of 1-year-old almond trees after 1 year of growth, and they look pretty good. You wouldn't say that they were under stress. You can tell by the shade on the ground, this is late in the season, about how big the trees are, and you can kind of see by the scale here. Now these trees had water potentials on average for the whole season of about 15 bars, so that's mild to moderate stress. That was the dry treatment. The medium treatment, you can see a lot more shade on the ground, and these had much higher or much less negative water potential, so lower values of 12 bars, bigger trees, but even these trees were not as well off as these trees that were at 8 bars. So very low blood pressure in these trees, lots of shade on the ground, very, very large trees. So the trees respond to stress. The trees respond to irrigation deficit based on the stress that they're receiving. This has been the case not just for almonds, but for many types of trees. So these are Bartlett pear trees, and here we have the scale on the x-axis from very low stress or almost no stress, maybe about 7 bars, down to about 20 bars of stress, which is a fair amount of stress. And this basically shows that the trees that were not under stress had the highest fruit size, about 170, 180 gram fruit, and the trees that were under more stress had smaller fruit. So this is not surprising. And in terms of pear trees, though, there was an opposite effect on soluble solids, so that the driest trees had the highest soluble solids. So even in pears, there's a trade-off, and this is probably going to be the case for pretty much all fruit and nut trees, some trade-off between negative effects of stress and perhaps positive effects of stress. So in prunes, we have a lot of research to indicate that there are some benefits of mild to moderate stress, and we call this regulated deficit irrigation when you purposely stress the trees. It increases the fruit sugar concentration, just like I showed you for the pears. And this actually decreases drying cost in prunes. When they're grown for drying, it will actually increase a little bit the flower density and the yield, and of course it saves water. And there's a publication here on the bottom that you can read a little bit more about this strategy. Now, in almond, we also have evidence that there is some benefit of stress, and that is during this process called hull split. So the almond hull starts splitting sort of in July, and that means it's getting close to harvest. And that's also a time when the almonds are very sensitive to hull rot disease. And so when you use a mild to moderate stress level in the trees around this time, you can actually increase the speed of hull split. You can reduce the disease hull rot. It will also improve harvestability, and of course, just like in prunes, it can save water. And we haven't found any negative impacts on yield when we use mild to moderate stress, which is about 14 to 18 bars for an almond tree during this time. And there's also a publication here that you can read about that. Now, when you impose deficit irrigation, you are going to see very clear differences from tree to tree or local areas in your orchard because the soils are different. It will highlight differences in soils. So for instance, for these trees, we were deficit irrigating these trees to improve hull split, as I just mentioned, but the exact same irrigation for those trees on that soil, even though the trees were right next to them, was too much stress on the soil to the left. So one of the advantages of using the pressure chamber is that you can detect these levels of stress before they become severe, as you see in this picture, and maybe alter your irrigation practices to adjust for the differences that you have in the soils. So, in terms of conclusions, you should control weeds, try to tune up your irrigation system, and plan for a certain percent of normal ET based on what the water that you have available. If you only have 50% of your normal amount of water, then you'll only be able to give the trees 50% of full ET, but that should still go up and down over the season as ET goes up and down. Expect to see differences in soils when you deficit irrigate. Use the pressure chamber to determine when to start irrigating, and I have a tentative recommendation that you can wait for below the baseline values before starting, and perhaps even wait for substantially below the baseline. And also you can use the pressure chamber to detect and give you an early warning about where the trees and what blocks of trees are going to be more problem than other blocks that may need a little bit more attention. And you can expect to see reduced yield this year and perhaps even a more reduced yield next. So thank you very much for your attention, and thanks to the support as you see here.